and you will hear very little from me today. We're here to focus on Todd, our guest host today. She spent 10 years in the beer industry, including time running labs at Zero Gravity and Magic Hat. Currently runs Zymology labs in Vermont. And if you haven't been able to grab the handouts up front, please stop in at the end. Otherwise, we'll turn over the floor.
Alright, hello, welcome everyone. Can everyone hear me if I talk over here? Or there's just raise your hand if it's not loud enough, but I can use the mic here. Welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. I love seeing so many people interested in learning more about quality. This is also my first in-person event in several years, so I'm actually excited to be here. And if you guys see me walking around in the next several days, please don't hesitate to come up and say hi. So my name is Todd, and I help Brewers make better beer through analytical testing, consulting, and training. I'm the owner of Zymology Labs, which is a third-party testing lab located in Essex Junction, Vermont. So it allows brewers to expand on their current quality program without needing to invest in expensive equipment or increase labor. Like Tim said, I have been working in some sort of lab or quality for over 15 years with kind of that being specifically in the beer industry. So the day in the lab. So we all know that really big breweries all have labs, and a fair amount of the medium-sized breweries have labs as well, and even some of the really small breweries have labs. But what actually happens in the lab? What do you need for equipment? What do you need for labor? Is every brewery doing the same thing, or is it different? Is every day the same? Is every day different? And, well, as you all know, every brewery is different. And so I'm going to be saying this over and over again today, but every lab is going to be different. Every quality program is different. And you're going to have to figure out what makes the most sense for you based on your priorities, your resources, or what you have for labor, what you're able to invest in. I'm definitely focusing on things to get you started today. So the most expensive thing I'm going to talk about is a microscope. But most of this is stuff that you can get started with minimal equipment, with minimal training. I know lab can sometimes be a scary word for the non-science folks out there, but I don't want the word lab to scare anyone away. So don't think that you need to have a lab in the traditional sense. You don't need a separate room with sterile countertops and trained scientists in white lab coats and fancy air ventilation systems. That's certainly something to aspire to, but not something that you need when you're first starting out. So I tend to prefer the term quality program over lab. I feel like it focuses a little bit more about the process and the beer instead of the location. Fortunately, a day in the quality program is not as catchy as a day in the lab, so I'm going for this. So today we'll be talking about what? So we talked about what you don't need for a lab, but what do you need for your space? Then we'll also get into what makes a quality program. You wouldn't be here if you didn't think that quality was important. So you probably have some inkling as to why you want to start a quality program, but I'll also share a few of my favorite whys. And then we'll go into an example schedule. So like I already said and warned you that I would keep saying this, every lab is going to be different. So every schedule is going to be different. This is going to be kind of a baseline to get you started to think about what's possible. So I know often hesitations for starting a lab or a quality program is just that you have no idea where to start, what's even possible. So we'll go through that schedule and then go into some more detail on some of the individual items. Unfortunately, we can't do all the testing all the time, but we'll go through how to pick some of your priorities. So at the end, for those of you who didn't get a worksheet, there's a sheet up here that just kind of helps you walk through what are some of the questions to ask yourselves to start to think about what your priorities are, where to start. Another thing with a quality program is to start small. You don't need to do it all at once. Just starting somewhere is going to give you a leg up over some of those other things. And then I want to leave you with some resources. Again, this is a lot of stuff that we're going to cover today, so I'm not really able to get too much into detail on some of these things. So I wanted to give you places to go to find more information about some of those topics. All right, so what do we need for space? So these first three pictures here sort of are the progression of Zymology Labs. So when I first started Zymology Labs in 2016, I started in the back warehouse of another brewery, Zero Gravity. I got my $40,000 instrument on a folding table next to the boiler room, which again, you don't need that kind of equipment to get started. That is what third-party labs are for. But basically just that sink and countertop space. Zero Gravity went through an expansion at about 15,000 barrels, at which point they built out their own lab, separate space. And then I started running their quality program while I built up Zymology labs on the side. And I have since moved into my own location. So really we just need countertop space. We need a spot to house our pH meter, our hydrometer's microscope, maybe a little bit of storage for some labware, countertop space to do a little bit of work, and that's really all that you need to do. Now you're all brewers, you can get very creative with space, so maybe you have a drain and a hose that's conveniently located. You can find what works for your brewery. So we talked about our space. So now what makes a quality program? So a quality program is a way for us to ensure that every time you put out a product, every beer that you put out is going to either meet or exceed your customers' needs and expectations. So if you're putting out an inconsistent product, you're not meeting your customers' needs and expectations. Maybe sometimes you are, but not always. If you're putting out a product with defects, be it a flavor defect, or crooked labels, or short fills, or overcarbonation, you're not meeting your customers' needs and expectations. And if you can't meet their needs and expectations, they're not going to stay your customer. So we want to put in place a set of rules or guidelines to help increase our chances of successfully putting out a quality product every time we make a batch of beer. A quality product being one that is free from defects and meets or exceeds your customers' needs and expectations. So your customers are going to be different breweries. So your customers might not have the same needs and expectations as the macro brewers. They're probably not going to expect that same level of consistency, but they are going to have different needs and expectations. Maybe they want a little bit more complexity in numbers. So that's our quality program. So why do we want to start a quality program? Why are we going to go through all this? Quality often gets put on the back burner. There are almost 9,000 breweries in the US, and the number just keeps going up. And if you're not meeting your customers' needs and expectations, someone else will. It's a very crowded marketplace, and the bar is set very high. There's a lot of great beer out there. I sometimes joke, but there's quite a bit of truth to it, that I started Zymology Labs because I don't want to drink that beer. And I want brewers to all have access to the same equipment, the same information that the big brewers do. And there's a lot of stuff that you can do yourself, you just might not be aware of. You don't know what you don't know. And the more that we know about our beers, the more we're able to control and predict and make adjustments. So, we like to think that we're in control of the brewing process, and to a certain degree you are. You can fix the recipe and select your ingredients and improve your skills. But we've all heard the saying that brewers make work and yeast make beer. And ultimately, we're relying on billions of tiny organisms to affect the final flavor of our beer. And sometimes, despite our best efforts, things don't go according to plan. And when that happens, we want to be ready for it. We want to be able to make adjustments. We want to make proactive decisions instead of reactive decisions. And the more you know about your beer, the more you can predict, the more you can make those adjustments. Maybe you have an issue with a particular batch of beer and you're not able to fix that batch, but maybe you're able to adjust and fix the next batch. Not only are we dealing with a fermented product, but we're also dealing with agricultural ingredients. So our suppliers might have inconsistencies. Our customers don't necessarily care about that. They still want to get a consistent beer. So the more that you know about how those ingredients are behaving on your system and your process, you can adjust and still continue to provide your customers with a consistent beer. If you check your final pH and you get 4.2, what does that tell you? It tells you absolutely nothing if you don't know where that beer is supposed to finish. So you need a baseline of your numbers. If that beer normally finishes at 4.2, that's great. You may have a different issue, but it's not your pH. If that beer normally finishes at 4.5, maybe you have an infection. And you can use other tools that you have in your quality toolbox and go through and see what might have happened. All right, we're going to get into our schedule now. So, as I said, everybody's different. And this is sort of based off of a packaging brewery that has a full-time lab person doing a little bit of micro. So I'm sure not all of you are at that stage yet, but I wanted to give you this kind of insight of view into what might be something to aspire to in your brewery. If you don't have a full-time lab person, that's totally fine. All of these things can be split among team members. So maybe your packaging team members do the line checks, and your cellar person does the pH and graphics, and your brewer does the cell counts. So you can split it up amongst other people, or maybe you're at the stage where you're trying to decide if you're ready for hiring a full-time lab person. Maybe some of these are things that other people are doing that you can then put onto that quality person. And don't forget that quality is not just the responsibility of someone in the lab, whoever's running the quality program, it's a responsibility of everyone. So quality should be part of everyone's job description, and everybody should always be thinking about it. So I'm going to quickly read through these, and then I'll go back through into a little bit more detail in each of these. So we're going to start with a quick schedule review, packaging line checks, pH and gravity samples, data entry and analysis. We'll collect some micro, read plates, move our non-daily tasks, go to eat lunch, and then plate some micro, email questions, tank checks, shift updates. Easy, right? Guys got that? All right, so our schedule review. If you're a packaging brewer, you're probably going to start packaging right away. But before that, I like to do just a quick schedule review, just make sure there weren't any last-minute changes. Make sure you have the right tank hooked up, the right beer is ready to be packaged. We all know a brewer who's hooked up to the wrong tank before, so make sure everybody's on the same page. Some other things you might want to be checking with the schedule is taking a look at what's going on for the rest of the day, or maybe what's happening for the rest of the week. What samples are you going to need to be collected throughout the day? What micro samples do you need? What beers are fermenting? Are you brewing that day? Do you need cell counts? Is anything being dry out? So take a look at kind of the overview of what you're going to need, and that's going to help plan out your day and also your week. We're going to get into some of the non-daily tasks in a minute, but there might be, some days are going to be heavier than other days. So maybe some of your non-daily tasks you move on to a less busy day. For our packaging line checks, at these times, I'm not really very good at estimating how long it takes to do things, and again, it's going to depend on the size of your brewery, so how many samples you need to be collected is going to, affect how long it takes to do each of these. So these are just kind of rough guidelines here. So for your packaging line checks, you might want to be checking the tank, before you package that beer. And different breweries are going to have, some have sign-off sheets before a beer can be transferred or packaged. Find what's going to work for your brewery. Sometimes you want that level of scrutiny. Sometimes, you don't want somebody running to you every 10 minutes and if you're the owner saying, okay, is this ready, is this good? So figure out, who has authority to make those checks, which checks are important. You don't want to get into a situation where you say, oh, our CO2 spec is, 2.65 plus or minus 0.05, and then get into, if you're out of spec, you're still letting it go. Or, you don't want to, if you start having gray areas or you're not always checking a certain parameter, you're going to get into nobody's checking anything. And you probably won't get to that severe. But just make sure that the things that you have on a checklist, if it needs to be passed before it can go on to the next stage, make sure those are things that actually need to be checked and followed through. Don't leave white spaces on your checklist. So some things you might be checking on your tank are your dissolved oxygen, your CO2, sensor. Make sure it's right here. Make sure there aren't any obvious off-flippers. Then check your packaging line as well. Check any cleaning validation. So if you've got titration kits or however you clean your line, you could do some ATP swabs on your fill heads. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. It's an energy molecule found in all living things. So you can get these $2,000 ATP luminometers. Like I said, sorry, I lied. I said the most expensive thing is going to be a microscope, but a luminometer. So you do a little swab on your surface. So it can be a fill head, it can be a tank, it can be conveyor belts, and you put it in your reader, and in 15 seconds you get a relative light unit number. The higher it is, the more debris is left over. So this is just kind of a quick check to see how well you clean that canning before you bring your product over. So People sometimes don't like these ATP luminometers because it doesn't tell you necessarily if what I just there is alive, it doesn't tell you what it is. To me, it's enough just to know that something was left behind. So once you know that your canning line is good to go, then you might do some checks in the actual product. So again, once it's in the can, your dissolved oxygen, your CO2, your sensor. Then other checks that you have the capability to test for. So you might not have a deal. Maybe that's not something that goes on your checklist. Like you're checking your fill weights. Make sure your fill levels are good. Your sieves, your trims, whatever kind of equipment that you have, make sure that that product is going to be good, stable. Maybe set aside some cans for microtesting. You do sensory again, your date codes. Make sure you're updating your date coder to the date and the batch. And if you don't have an inkjet date coder, have some way of actually noting when those beers were packaged. So if you get into a situation where a month or two from now, something comes up. Unfortunately, despite all of our best efforts with all of our testing, we might get into a situation where we have a microinfection that we weren't able to detect right away. Some of these are very slow growing, and maybe 1 month or 2 months from now, then we've got some re-fermentation. So we don't want to have to do a market withdrawal on everything that's from that one brand. We want to know just the stuff from that one date, from that one batch, and be able to do a market withdrawal on that. Or maybe there's something with the ingredient supplier. Maybe they had a recall. You want to know exactly which batches those ingredients went into so that you can isolate just those potential problem batches. All right, our pH and gravity samples. So this is probably something that everyone is doing already. At least gravity samples. If you're not, take your gravity samples every day until while your beer is fermenting. But while you've also got you've got your gravity sample all degassed and ready for the drain, take a quick pH sample of that as well. Then you can take it one step further with these, and you can chart that out. So again, have it easy for people to write things down. So have a table where your employees or you can write down the date, the time, the temperature, the gravity, the pH. Sometimes it's enough to be able to look through all these numbers. For me, sometimes it's much easier if I have a visual representation of what's going on. So for every batch of beer that you make, every time you make that one beer, it should be following a fairly consistent fermentation curve. So this isn't something you necessarily need to do every single time. Maybe the first 5 or 6 times you brew a batch of beer, you're going to plot out your gravity by hour. And again, the more you know about your beers, the more you can predict. And maybe you notice that your starting gravities are all over the place. So that's going to give you an indication of somewhere to start working to improve your beers. So it's one of the things that separates the good brewers from the great brewers is that the great brewers are always looking for ways to improve their beer, to make it better. Maybe you notice that the length of time to get to terminal varies a lot. So maybe you want to look into your pitch rate. So the more information you have, the more ideas you get about where you can start to improve your beers. Your pH curve will also follow a similar pattern for each batch, each beer that you ferment. So different beers are obviously going to have different curves, but if you're making the same beer over and over, and your pH curve is going to dip and go back up a little bit at the end, that can be an indication if it's a new beer, if it's done fermenting, or if maybe you're in a stalled fermentation situation. This can also be really helpful if you're brewing seasonal beer. So if you haven't brewed a beer in 6 months and you don't necessarily remember quite how that went, you can compare your curves. This, I only have 2 up here. So the more curves you have, again, the more data you have, the more information you have, you're going to get an even better representation of those fermentations. All right, our data entry and analysis. So make sure you're setting aside time to actually look at your data and actually use your data. So we just talked a good example with doing the graphs. You don't want to just be collecting data just for data's sake. You want to actually use that and make decisions off of that information. If, we talked about the pH, sometimes it feels like we might not be doing stuff with our data, but sometimes those are our quality control checks. So if you're always checking your final gravity and up here it's always 4.2, it might feel like you're not doing anything with that data, but you're making sure that you're within that range, what's acceptable for your brewery. And it's that one time that it's not where it is, that you want to be able to take action. You want to know as soon as you can. So same with micro. Maybe you're doing some micro on your bright tanks and they're always clean, always clean. You gotta keep doing it because that's the one time that it's not clean that you want to take action. And imagine if you did find an infection in your bright tank and maybe put that tank on hold. Maybe you know, sometimes with micro it can be hard if you don't have flavor issues right away. It might be something that's going to develop later. You don't always know. Sometimes you just can put a tank on hold and get some more information about it. Maybe you're going to divert it to kegs instead of a packaged product. It's going to go quicker and it's going to stay cold. You got a better chance of not running into issues of overcarbonated packages or whatever it may be. But think about, you know, quality is often people think of it as an expense. But if you did find that infection in your bright tank, think of how much money you're saving by not sending it to the can line, by not putting it out in distribution. All the headache that you're saving from not having to get that in your back. You're saving your potential hit on your reputation, all the negative social media that might be out there. So the more that we know, the more we can make these decisions. And sometimes it makes it easier to make those hard decisions. No one wants to dump a batch of beer. But if you have all of these points telling you something happened with this batch of beer, and that you're not very comfortable with putting the beer out. Don't forget that every beer that you put out might be somebody's first experience with your beer. They might not be as forgiving. I know as brewers, sometimes we have some more understanding of what might have happened to a batch of beer. It might be a little bit more forgiving. But customers out there don't know that necessarily. That might be their first time trying your beer and thinking, oh, this is awful. I'm going to go to one of these other 9,000 breweries instead. So we'll get into micro a little bit here. Collecting and complaints. So micro is another one that can be kind of a scary word. So don't think that you need to be a trained microbiologist to do any of this stuff to get started. When I come from chemistry. When I started in beer, I didn't have any micro background, and I just learned stuff from the job. So just playing around with your yeast and different plates and doing some cell counting, and that's going to really get you far. For getting started with micro, I tend to recommend that brewers start with a sterile wort testing. So grab a sterile sample. The American Society of Brewing Chemists, ASBC, and the Brewers Association, they have some free training videos on how to collect sterile samples, so I'll refer you guys to them. But so collect a sterile sample off of your heat exchanger, put that somewhere warm for a couple days, and look for any signs of fermentation. So this is going to tell you if you boiled your wort properly, and make sure that there's nothing in your heat exchanger. So you haven't added any yeast yet, you shouldn't have any signs of fermentation. And this is just a quick check that you can get, within 3 days. So if you use a sterile bag and it pops up, there's a sign of some sort of fermentation. Or if you use a tube and you hear a crack, a hiss of carbonation, or some turbidity, or an off aroma, there might be something with your heat exchanger. And imagine finding that within 3 days instead of 2 or 3 weeks from now when your beer starts to develop off flavors. How many beers have gone through that heat exchanger in that amount of time? So the sooner we know, the sooner we can make adjustments. HLP is the next thing I tend to recommend brewers get going with. So HLP stands for Hughes Lactobacillus pediococcus, and it detects for lactobacillus and pediococcus, which are the two most common beer spoiling bacteria that we're going to run into in the brewery. So it kind of covers a lot of your bases. It's not too difficult to get started with. So in terms of equipment, you're going to need, so here I've got the test tubes there, the test tube rack. You need, usually media will come in a powdered form. So you're going to need a way to weigh it out, add water, boil it. HLP does not require an autoclave. You can use a microwave to boil it or a hot plate. If you're using a microwave for media, just don't use it for anything else. And then you'll need, either if you don't have a line for a Bunsen burner, you can get an alcohol lamp. Those are $10. And some sterile pipettes. And that's pretty much, you might want an incubator at this point to get better temperature control. And micro is probably where I would maybe suggest having a separate location for doing any of this micro. You don't want to have people walking in and out while you're trying to do any micro. You don't want to be near your mill or anything like that. You can get, so this up here is a ductless laminar flow hood. So you can get those on wheels too. So you can, if you don't have a separate room for doing your micro, you can get one of those. You can wheel it to wherever is most convenient to do your micro, spray down your area with ISO, and you're good to go. One note on laminar flow hoods versus chemical hoods is the laminar flow hood is going to filter the air coming in, and it protects your samples and then pushes that out at you. And a chemical fume hood is going to suck up the vapors of your chemicals and push them out. So you want to make sure that you are using the right hood for the right job. You can't just get one and be good. I always use, whenever I'm doing HLP, a positive and a negative control. So for my negative control, when I'm any of the work that I'm doing, I'm just going to have a sample that's open. So if that sample came back contaminated, and HLP tubes are another good one to get started with because it's very obvious when you have growth or you don't have growth. So if my negative sample came back with growth in it, that means my environment wasn't I didn't do a good enough job keeping that area clean. And for my positive control, I'll just get a little bit of grain dust, since we know there's lactobacillus in there. And if my positive control doesn't show any growth, then that means I did something wrong with making the media. So if I'm adding a known source and I'm not getting any growth, then something happened in that process. Maybe I did it too warm or didn't make it properly. So you can use those controls to make sure, give you that assurance that you're doing the test properly. You do want to check SDSs, your safety data sheets, anytime you're working with anything new. So HLP does contain 0.14% of cyclohexamide, which is a yeast inhibitor. So it's going to increase the chances of your bacteria to grow, but it's harmful to yeast and it's also harmful to humans. And you're not supposed to use it when you're pregnant. Different SDSs, I've seen some say to use a fume hood. Some of them will say to use N95 mask, or you can get one of those hefty-duty plastic respirator masks. And in terms of other media, so once you've got your HLP down, you can start branching out into different types of media. So again, the more information that we have, the more we know about our peers. So maybe you have a wild yeast infection. If you're just testing for bacteria, that's not necessarily going to show up anything. But we also have to keep in mind that anytime we're adding more tests, that's more time. It's going to take longer to do this, to make your media, to collect the samples, and to actually plate your peers, which you'll get more information. There's lots of media that are designed specifically for the beer industry, and all of the suppliers will be able to tell you more about them. Some of them are liquid form too, so you don't have to do any prep. There's plenty of places that also sell pre-made media, so if you're just getting started, it's going to be more expensive per sample that you do if you're buying pre-made media, but that might be a good way to learn the different types and what's going to be the most sense for your brewery. Think about what you have in your brewery, what kind of yeast strains you're using. If you have something that has a diastatic strain in it, you might want to use a media that's specifically going to detect that. And in terms of more equipment, the only thing some media will require the use of an autoclave. I have a friend, Dana Garvis, who runs Oregon Brew Lab. She has some really great videos on using a microwave instead of an autoclave. So she's done a lot of trials, so I would definitely check that out. So there's a lot more coming out that you don't necessarily need these expensive pieces of equipment, these barriers to start. For schedule, I'll often check for my micro, grab a sample at 24 to 48 hours into fermentation. I want to find out something as soon as possible. So if there is something growing in there, I want to know as soon as I can. The only problem with that is sometimes it might be such a low infection that at that stage you're not able to detect it yet. It's not showing up on any of your media. So I'll take another sample 7 days into fermentation. And then every time that beer moves, I'll grab another sample. And this is, again, the more information you have, you can backtrack, figure out if you do have some sort of a hit. You want to know where it came from to help get rid of it. Unfortunately, with traditional micro, you're often not getting results until 3 to 7 days. So by the time you're getting results, the beer might have already been moved, or it might have already been packaged. It might not even be in your brewery anymore. But at least knowing that beforehand, we can keep a closer eye on that batch. Since we have adequately decoded our beer, we know where it's going if we do have some sort of an issue. Every time you package beer, set aside a 6-pack, warm and cold stored. And then if later on you need to go back and check on that batch, or if you have some sort of a concern, you can keep checking on that beer, monitor it for flavor issues or increased carbonation. And just, you want to know these things before your customers do. You don't want to find out on social media that you've got exploding cans out in the marketplace. You want to be the one to find it. Hopefully you don't even get to that point. That's another one of the things with quality, can be hard to calculate that return on investment, because often you don't even know what you're saving if you're preventing things from ever happening in the first place. When we get into identification, so sometimes it's enough just to know that you have something growing in your brewery and you need to work on cleaning it. And sometimes if you know exactly what it is, it might be a little bit more easy or helpful to mitigate what that problem might be and to eliminate it. So we can use different types of media. That's going to help us narrow down what we might have growing in our brewery. You can also do gram stain, so it's a series of dyes. You're going to put a little sample on a microscope slide. You will need a microscope for this. And it's going to help classify your bacteria as either gram-positive or gram-negative. Those are the two kind of classifications, and you can go through decision trees and see, which bacteria that might be, or a wild yeast. You can also take a look at the shape under the microscope and see what you might have growing. All right, our emails, questions, tank checks. So in the lab, you're going to have a lot of people probably coming up to you all day long asking you questions, and you might have a lot of fires to put out. So make sure you've got some time built in there just for the unexpected things that are going to expect the unexpected to happen in the lab. You also have to make sure that you're able to communicate clearly with everyone in the brewery. So you might have, and again, it's going to depend on your brewery, if maybe the quality person, what kind of authority they have in terms of stopping the canning line or putting beer in controls. Does that need to go through an owner first or a manager? Figure out how you want that to happen. But you also need to make sure that your quality person feels comfortable telling you when there's a problem. You don't want your quality person to be scared to say something. It is not the quality person's fault that there is an infection, or we don't want to blame anyone. But it can be difficult to, you're always the bearer of bad news. I remember when I worked at Magic Hat, every time I would go out to the packaging line, I felt like everybody would run away from me. They were worried that I was going to tell them that the labels were crooked or something, which they often were. And then, so you also need to be able to communicate, if you have multiple shifts. So do you need to communicate that, this tank isn't quite ready, the CO2 needs to come up on it before it's ready for the next day to be packaged? Are you communicating with the brewer, if you're doing the cell counts, how much yeast they need to pitch on the next batch of beer? And if the tank needs to be put on hold, maybe a certain tank, you're not quite sure if you should be using that yeast, reusing that yeast. So make sure you're able to communicate with everyone. You might also be in charge of checking tanks for the following day, make sure things are good to be packaged. That, again, might be on someone in the cellar, so you can split up some of these things. So to get into some of our non-daily stuff, we've got our media prep, so we talked a little bit about that. So again, it's going to depend on the type of media that you're using in your brewery. So HLP can be stored for 2 weeks at refrigerated temperatures. If you're using FADM, fiber-frame diastaticus medium, that needs to be used within 24 hours of making it. So you're going to have to adjust your schedule based on what samples you need to collect for the day. Special projects, so this might be another really big part of having your quality program. Maybe you're doing some R&D or looking into certain issues. It might be troubleshooting, or maybe you're working on trying to make something better. Usually when we're doing cell counts for yeast, we're doing 1 million cells per degree ale is kind of the standard starting point. But maybe your particular stout or your IPA does better at 1.2 million cells. So you can do some trial and error and see, play around with some different citrates, see what comes out with a more consistent product or a more flavorful product. Maybe you're looking into your dry hopping rates. Maybe, do we get a better flavor profile in day 2 versus day 3? So sensory can definitely be a big part of your test. It doesn't all have to be analytical instruments. Your palate can be a very sensitive instrument. Sometimes it's more sensitive than some of the very expensive pieces of equipment. Your SOP, standard operating procedures, is probably my least favorite part of the lab. But having that everything written down, how you're supposed to run everything. So not just for the lab equipment, but every part of the brewery as well. So they can be used for while you're doing your training. Have someone in, have that sheet that you're explaining to everyone. You don't want somebody to train one person and then they train someone else and then they train someone else, and then before you know it, nobody is doing things the same way. Especially if you have multiple brewers or you have multiple people who are doing the same thing, you want to make sure that to have consistent beer, you need to consistently make it. So make sure that you are following everything in the same way. Your sensory panel training. So we haven't talked too much about sensory, but this is a really big piece of quality. It's one of those that the more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. So it takes a lot of time. You can do it fairly inexpensively, but if you're getting into a lot of the off-flavor spike kits, those can get fairly expensive. You might have just a quick kind of go, no-go before you're packaging a beer. Or you might have a weekly panel where you're checking true to target, make sure your beers are true to brand, that they taste how they're supposed to. You might have a weekly or a monthly training on off flavors or also on flavors. So usually we're very focused on off flavors, which we don't want in our brewery. And being able to detect those and identify them are going to help in your troubleshooting. If you know the source of one of those off flavors, it's much easier to troubleshoot that. But we also want to think about our on flavors. So what are those unique flavors that make your beer special? And you want to make sure that those are there every time. You can use Draft Labs. It's a really great piece of software to do sensory tracking. It is about $50 a month, I believe. You can also use Google Forms and just make a free form on your phone. So then every beer or your panel, you can just have some checks. Is this beer true to target? Does it look how it's supposed to? And go through all of those checks. We talked a bit about our data review and analysis. So you might have that kind of daily check where you're entering data, but also where you're maybe going through and looking a little bit more in depth into some of those items that you're investigating. Or maybe you have a report that you send out every week or every month, maybe on micro. So this is what we got for micro hits this week, or we didn't have anything. Or maybe there's a special project that you're working on and you're giving updates and seeing what else is happening. Maybe you need to get some information from other parts of the brewery and connect some of that information. Root cause analysis. So anytime you do have some sort of an issue or something that comes up in the brewery, so maybe it's an infection or maybe it's a low starting gravity. You want to go back through and see, okay, what happened and how do we prevent that from happening next time? So maybe it was, a simple mistake, a valve was turned the wrong way. Go through and say, okay, how do we stop that from happening again? So the more we know, the more we can prevent some of these things from happening in the next batch of beer. Instrument maintenance, so sometimes if you do have a separate place for your lab, that can be a safe spot for some of your very expensive equipment that you might have out on the line, like dissolved oxygen meters or CO2 meters. Maybe those live in the lab, and the lab person is also responsible for calibrating those. Your DO meters do need to be calibrated, preferably quarterly. Your pH meter should be calibrated at least weekly. So maybe that's the role of the quality person, is to also maintain some of that equipment. Don't forget, your data is only as good as the instruments that you use. So if you're using improperly calibrated instruments and basing data off of that, then you might be making decisions off of incorrect information. And that's not going to help. Your customer feedback and investigation. So anytime somebody writes in about either a complaint or something good that happened with their beer, have a log, keep track of all that. Maybe you start noticing trends. You can go back to that beer library, taste that beer as well, see if you notice the same thing that your customer is talking about. Maybe it's oxidation, and they don't have a good way of describing that. They might not have used the same language that we do. So you can go back and see, okay, well maybe it's because they had a beer that was a year old, or you know that because of your date codes. Or maybe it's a month old and it's showing signs of oxidation. So maybe you need to step up your dissolved oxygen process and make sure that you're not getting oxidized beer there. And maybe it's something else that you weren't aware of yet. And take the time to respond to that customer too. If they have some sort of a complaint and they're telling you about it, they had an unhappy experience with your product. And if you're taking the time to respond to them, look into it, then they're probably going to be your super fans instead of just never buying a beer. And then my favorite, salt counts. So you can get everything that you need for salt counting for under $500. You can get microscopes, $250, $300. Your chemocytometers, probably the next most expensive piece. Weber Scientific is a good place to get chemocytometers. If you don't want anything that's less than $100, it's probably not going to be very good. So basically, we're going to make a 1 to 100 dilution of our yeast slurry. So you can either do that by weight or by volume. And then you're going to put a little drop on your chemocytometer, which has these 2 counting chambers on it with a grid. So you can count how many yeast cells are on there. And then based on the number of yeast cells you see and the chamber, the volume chamber in there, you can calculate how many yeast cells you have in 1 ml of yeast. And then you can use that information to calculate how much yeast you need to pitch into your big batch of beer based on the type of beer, the size, and the starting gravity. I know some brewers will do a pound of yeast per barrel of beer, which can, be fine. But without actually counting those yeast cells, you have no idea how many cells are in that pound of yeast. One day, you might have a lot, you might have really thick slurry. Another day, it might be really thin, and you're going to have a completely different number of yeast cells in there. You can also do methylene blue stains. So it's just this dye that you can get that will tell if your yeast cells are alive or dead. The dead cells can't metabolize the dye, so they remain blue, and the live cells can. This can tell you how many live yeast cells that you are pitching. So you want to not only pitch the right number of yeast cells, but you also want to pitch the right number of live yeast cells. I know we're often concerned with underpitching our beer, which certainly leads to stressed out yeast and off flavors and a whole host of issues. But we also need to be concerned with overpitching our yeast. So it's probably 1 or 2 times, probably not a huge deal. There's this yeast lab out in Canada, Escarpment Labs, that has a lot of really great YouTube videos, and they have a lot of great information on yeast. And they give a great example of comparing yeast to humans. So let's say you're having a barbecue, you invite 10 people, you cook enough food for 10 people, and then they all show up with a guest. So now you've got 20 people, and you only have enough food for 10 people. You probably still have enough beer for 20 people because you planned ahead. But now they're going to get food, they're going to be okay. But if that continues to happen, if that keeps happening, they're not getting enough food. So your food, being the sugars in your work, they're going to eventually start to be a little grumpy, and they're not going to work as hard. And you might end up with more dead cells than live cells. If you have too much yeast, you can also get hot spots too, and that can affect the consistency of your fermentation. All right, so how do we put everything together? So we have to think about how to prioritize what we're going to do based on our resources and stuff. So I like to go through the who, what, when, why, where. So you start with why. Why do you want to start your quality in the first place? You might have a specific reason for starting your quality program. Maybe you do have exploding cans out in the marketplace and you want to make sure you never have that happen again. Or maybe you just started packaging. Or you just started your brewery and you want to make sure that quality is a really key component of your brewery from day one. So whatever your why, write that down. Keep coming back to this. Like I said before, quality is often something that gets put on the back burner. Instead of investing in quality, you're buying a new tank. Now you can store more beer and you can make more beer. Or investing in a packaging line. But if you're not consistently making that quality beer, then you can get only so far. So then all of these are going to be interconnected. So who's going to be running these tests? How much time do they have? When are they going to be running these tests? Are you adding someone new, or is it somebody who already has a full-time job and needs to take on some of these responsibilities? What are they going to be testing for? That's going to depend on what you have for equipment. What is their training skill set? Do you need to take time to train them? Where are you going to be doing this? Do you need to create a space before you can get started? Do you have something already set up? And go through your priorities, come back to your why, think about why you wanted to start this in the first place, and figure out what's going to work best for your brewery. How are you going to incorporate all these things? And start small, so definitely break things down. Start with one piece at a time, and then go from there. So here's some resources. American Society of Brewing Chemists, Master Brewers Association, the Brewers Association, they all have a lot of really great webinars for members that we can check out, a lot of on-demand webinars. A lot of technical magazines, technical quarterlies, and forums as well. So talk to other brewers as well. Talk to the brewer sitting next to you and get their email if you have an issue later on. See if they can help you out there. These two books here, Quality Labs for Small Brewers by Merritt Waldron and Quality Management by Mary Pellegeri, are both really great resources to get you started. So they talk also about, quality philosophy and really getting that program to work for you, and then also some of the specific things that you need to be doing. So yeah, talk to fellow brewers. Feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer questions about quality that might come up. And some additional resources. If you were lucky enough to get a sheet that had legible stuff on the back, I'm sorry, I ran out of ink on my printer, so some of these sheets are only one-sided. Most of these resources are on my website, zymologylabs.com. There's a resources tab. I've got a sensory panel ebook, so just how to get your sensory panel started. There's a quality manual draft, so this is just a Google Doc that's free for whoever wants it. You don't have to give me your email address or anything like that. And it's just a way to start going through your quality program and actually start planning it out. So what are some of the things that you need to be asking yourself? What do you need for GMPs? Where do you go to find out more information about that? And what kind of information might you have in your quality manual? So again, it's going to be different for everyone. You might not use everything that's in there. You might take a lot out. You might be adding other things that are more relevant to your brewery. Article on how to write a standard operating procedure. This is a link to Dana's fireside chats, and she's got a lot of other really great videos on there. There's also one on identification of if you have any micro-infection. And then I also have the podcast, Check Your Beer, where the first season I host with my friend Julie of Boston's Finest Liquids, and the first season is just different aspects of how to start your brewery. So we've got an episode on dissolved oxygen and writing SOPs and sensory. And then the second season is where I interview other lab techs, different breweries, talk to them about what their day-to-day is, and then advice that they have for brewers getting started. They also get to start small. All right, any questions? Yeah?
When you were working out of the warehouse, did you have a laminar, have you ever worked without a laminar flow hood?
Yeah.
How important is that?
Yeah, so if you're going to want to be able to close off, at least have like a room if you don't have a laminar flow hood. But yeah, or maybe, if you have a room that you can use, put a sign on the door that, so you don't want people walking in and out. But if you have a flame, that area around your flame, so you're going to have to work closely to your flame, is going to be kind of sterilizing that air. It creates like a convection of a sterile environment. So yes, I've done plenty of micro without a laminar flow hood. You can get, if you don't have a gas lamp or a Bunsen burner, you can get an alcohol lamp. The only thing with the alcohol lamps is the flame's not super strong. But you can also get, the propane tanks that you use for camping. You can get a stand for those and use one of those. And then, spray down your countertops with 70% ISO. And definitely if you are concerned with contamination, have those positive and negative controls too, just so you can have a better idea. Any other questions?
Yeah. You didn't really go into it, but I think a lot of us here do like the basic BDK, diacetyl, like sensory testing, where we're taking a test tube of beer and putting it, on a coffee mug or something. I was wondering how sensitive, if you have any insight into like how sensitive that temperature range is. I typically see like 140 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. We usually aim for like 150 in there. Definitely, brewers, not me, of course. But like sometimes we'll be like, oh, it was 130 degree water, but I left it in longer. Is it a temperature time thing, or is it a specific range to get that?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
That's a good question. I don't know if it's,
I've also seen, we've recently got like a sample of a chemical test for have any experience with one or the other, or do you think the sensory
Yeah.
tends to be?
I have the only way that I've kind of had indirect experience is with measuring it on a gas chromatograph, which is like a
Yeah.
50,000 plus instrument. I would maybe try to, if you're able to trial some of those things, do it with your own sensory evaluation. So depending on if you are sensitive to diacetyl, if you're able to know the outcome when that happens. Anyone else? And if you think of a question later on, please feel free to email me. Happy to answer any questions. And, yeah.
How long have you been participating in the microwave already?
It's going to depend on, usually you want it to, so the HLP you want it to boil for 2 minutes. So I think you have to end up doing like 8 minutes. It's going to overflow if you just set it and go. So you have to kind of watch it. So you're going to be kind of starting and stopping in like increments of like 30 seconds. So it's going to be kind of a feel. I've only used HLP in the microwave, so Dana's videos might have more information about how long to do it, but usually, at least with the HLP, it needs to boil for 2 minutes, so you might start out 8 minutes, and then after 4, it's going to start boiling. Do a quick stop to let that kind of die down, and then start it back up again. Yep.
What is building a brewery designing now? Does it make sense to have the labs that closed room? It sounds like you think yes. I had that choice early.
I'm sorry.
Should the lab be a closed off room or does it need to be a corner of the room?
Ideally, at some point, you're going to want that closed off space. So, maybe that 10,000 to 20,000 barrel range, like per year, is where you're going to want a separate space. So if you have the ability or the capacity to start with that separate room, I would definitely do that. But if I don't want it to be a reason for people to not start a quality program because they don't have that space. So you don't need that when you're starting out, but if you have the space and the ability, you might as well start with that. Yeah. Check your beer. Go back. And I'm sure you have lots of resources with the New York State Guild as well.